Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in this auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at 15th and P Street in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience, are taped by City TV 5, are broadcast on government access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, and Beatrice, and are posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at www.nebraskahistory.org. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine and the Society's newsletter, use of a microfilm reader printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies of microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, discounts in the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock, and reduced fees for kids' classes. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society's Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. To find that YouTube page, just type www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical into your browser search. There are over 140 past brown bags on YouTube. Our speaker is Ruben Acosta, and the topic is A New Church for the Modern Age, Lincoln's Cathedral of the Risen Christ. Ruben is an architectural historian for the Nebraska State Historical Society, where he is National Register and Certified Local Government Coordinator. Prior to the Nebraska State Historical Society, he was an adjunct lecturer of U.S. history at Clayton State University outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Ruben obtained his master's in architectural history from the Savannah College of Art and Design in 2010. He wrote his thesis on the city's former Union Station. He is a member of the Southeastern chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians, where he presented a version of this talk at the organization's October 2015 conference. Just to let you know about asking questions, Ruben prefers you wait until the end. Please join me in welcoming Ruben Acosta.
Thank you, John. And thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to present my lecture today on the Cathedral of the Risen Christ, one of Lincoln's hidden modernist gems. This project came out of a desire to research this building as part of its 50th anniversary, which occurred just last year. It was constructed in 1965. And I felt that we had to bring attention to the cathedral, to its interesting architecture, and its place in the overall architectural history of Catholic churches in this country. So today, the format, it's going to be broken up into several parts. The first part, I'm going to do a very brief introduction to what is modern architecture, because when we talk about modern architecture in architectural history, there's a very specific meaning to it. And in fact, modern architecture is now essentially turning 100 years old for some of the earliest examples of it. And then we will get on to why the diocese needed a new cathedral in the 1960s. We'll talk about the design of the church, and then we'll talk about it in the larger context in terms of Vatican II and the reforms that were going on in the time period. So without further ado, we'll move forward. So what is modern architecture? In architectural history, modern architecture does not correspond to the contemporary, as in right now, but is instead used to describe a specific movement in architecture that dominated the first 2/3 of the 20th century. It encompassed a variety of architectural styles and approaches to design. Modern architecture was born out of a reaction to the industrial transformations of the late 19th century, which reshaped how and where people lived their lives. New building forms such as railway stations developed. New technologies such as iron and later steel broke the limitations that materials such as timber and stone had previously placed upon architects. At the same time, revolutions in the study of art and history led to a greater knowledge of the past, which architects then used to inform their new designs as part of an ever-growing toolbox of architectural expression. The late 19th century was dominated by a variety of revival styles and eclectic samplings of the past, which clothed technologically advanced buildings of iron and steel in the garments of previous architectural styles. Starting in the early 20th century, architects in Europe and later in the United States reacted to the lack of a stylistic focus by turning away from history and instead searching for a new architectural style that would match what some architectural theorists called the spirit of the age. Some architects, such as those of the Art Nouveau or arts and crafts movement, reacted against industrialization by focusing on individual workmanship and quality. Others, such as the Bauhaus in Germany or Le Corbusier in France, sought to incorporate arts and industry to create a new architecture that reflected and embraced technology and industrialization. The resulting buildings concentrated on overall forms, abstracted to their basic elements that took advantage of the freedom offered by steel frames, plate glass, and concrete. Ornament was reduced or eliminated in order to focus on pure form, which would clearly express the function of the building. The resulting international style, initially developed in the 19-teens and 1920s, would spread across the world in the 1930s as its proponents fled an increasingly hostile Europe, and would eventually become the style of industry, commerce, and government in the post-World War II era. Church architecture in this period was as varied as the competing styles for the mantle of modern. In the United States, parishes and architects mostly limited themselves to the late 19th century model, building modern buildings of iron, tile, and steel, and clothing them in a variety of revival styles such as Romanesque or Gothic revival. However, these buildings were clearly not copies of their medieval predecessors and reflected modern tendencies in massing, scale, composition, and simplification or abstraction of ornament. In other parts of the world, churches were pioneering buildings in their use of modern construction technology. For example, Auguste Perret's Notre Dame Le Rancy, which you can see here, one of the best examples of early reinforced concrete construction, which allowed for walls consisting of nothing but stained glass. A later example would be 1955's chapel at Notre Dame du Haut by Le Corbusier in Ronchamp, France, which further pushed the boundaries in concrete construction as well as church form. These developments were not unknown in the United States, and American architects and their potential clients would use these as models for their own buildings. This would lead to a new crop of American cathedrals that would be built clearly in the modern tradition in the post-World War II era. So why a new cathedral in Lincoln? Well, the Diocese of Lincoln, which encompasses the southern third of the state of Nebraska, was established back in 1887. Many of its original parishioners were immigrants from Europe, mostly Germans and other Central Europeans, and they built, after their initial wooden rustic churches, they would build brick revival churches in either Romanesque revival or Gothic revival styles. The first two cathedrals for the diocese, located here in Lincoln, St. Teresa's and later St. Mary's, followed in this style. You can see St. Mary's up on the screen. However, by the 1950s, the cathedral at St. Mary's just could not meet the needs of the diocese. It was too small. And therefore, the diocese decided to move forwards and investigate constructing a new cathedral. So what were the changes that were going on in the diocese? Well, by 1954, there were strong demographic forces that led the diocese to initiate a building boom under its then current bishop, Louis B. Kucera. The diocese had to grapple with two major issues: population growth and population redistribution. Annual censuses documented this growth. For example, in 1957, the total number of Catholics in the diocese topped 49,000 for the first time, having grown by 30% since 1946. By 1959, the population was nearly 51,000. This growth was not uniform and was concentrated primarily in Lincoln and other towns of eastern Nebraska. At the same time, rural parishes were declining as farms were consolidated, reducing the population density of agricultural areas. Smaller congregations were unable to maintain their original churches, necessitating the construction of newer facilities with lower maintenance requirements, often located in towns rather than in rural areas. Finally, a decline in vocations signaled the start of the modern priest shortage, further driving consolidation in rural areas. In response to these changes, Bishop Kucera initiated a building boom that totaled 121 new buildings, including churches, schools, hospitals, and religious houses, and 4 new parishes by the time of his death in 1957. Among his many achievements was the establishment of Holy Family Parish in Lincoln's southern suburbs, known as the Boulevards, and the purchase of land at 33rd Street and Sheridan Boulevard as a possible site for a new cathedral. However, it would be his successor, Bishop James V. Casey, who would mobilize the diocese's resources to construct a new cathedral. So, designing and building a new cathedral. In 1958, Bishop Casey commissioned a study on constructing a new chancery and cathedral. The existing facilities were antiquated and inadequate, but the building boom in schools and hospitals had placed a heavy load on the diocese's finances. A study committee was tasked with selecting a site for the cathedral, selecting an architect, and devising a plan to raise the necessary funds for what would be the largest building campaign ever in the diocese. 2 years later, as a result of the study, Bishop Casey initiated the Diocesan Development Campaign with the goal of funding construction of a new cathedral, a new chancery building, a convent, and a child care center. The drive would also fund projects in individual parishes, from new churches to schools to additions to existing buildings. The Diocesan Development Campaign would be a runaway success. By the end of the campaign, almost $4 million had been pledged, well over the original goal of $1.8 million. As part of the planning process for the development campaign, Bishop Casey and his fellow study committee members selected the firm of Leo A. Daly to design a new cathedral. The firm, based in Omaha, had worked on multiple projects for the Archdiocese of Omaha, including a brand new modern cemetery located in Omaha's western suburbs. Calvary Cemetery was among the first of the new memorial lawn-type cemeteries in Nebraska, and incorporated modern-style buildings into a plan organized around the Stations of the Cross. The firm also worked on projects in Lincoln, including the aforementioned Holy Family Church School, which dates to 1953. In the case of the cathedral, it is unclear exactly how the firm was selected. Unfortunately, many of the records at Leo A. Daly have been destroyed as part of their records management process, so we don't have any of the original communication between the architectural firm and the diocese as part of the selection process. What we do know is that the firm was selected to design the cathedral, most likely because of its prior experience with both the Archdiocese of Omaha and the Diocese of Lincoln. The firm began work on designing the cathedral and in 1960 completed a set of initial renderings and cost estimates. The bishop and the study group, in addition to selecting Leo A. Daly, also set the location at the intersection of 35th Street and Sheridan Boulevard, which you can see up on the screen. The site was chosen over other Lincoln locations as it provided ample space for the cathedral, a rectory, and the brand new chancery building. The land had previously been purchased by Bishop Kucera, and Holy Family Parish lobbied hard for the cathedral, as they lacked a permanent church and instead met in a multi-purpose international-style building located at 37th and Sheridan. The cathedral complex would be located to the west of Holy Family and would require the closing of 34th Street to accommodate the new construction. The publication of Daly's initial renderings coincided with the launch of the Diocesan Development Campaign. The original design called for a large concrete edifice with an arcaded nave and a receding concave facade and projecting semicircular arcaded narthex, which you can see in the screen, the concave face of the nave with the narthex projecting in the front. The Latin cross plan building included a low dome over the crossing, which would be topped by a slender spire and cross. The design, characterized as neoclassic by both the Lincoln Star and the Southern Nebraska Register, appeared to share more in common with the mission churches of the Southwest than the characteristic Gothic or Romanesque churches that dotted the plains of Nebraska. The Star provided details on the plan, including all concrete construction, floor-to-ceiling windows in the arches, inlaid mosaics, and copper roofing materials. Adjacent to the cathedral would be a bishop's chapel and rectory. The design blended modern and the traditional and was a forerunner for a burst of what would later be called New Formalism in Nebraska that would result in several significant examples of the style in the state, including the Sheldon Museum of Art, designed by noted architect Philip Johnson and constructed in 1963, and the Stir Museum of the Prairie Pioneer by Edward Durrell Stone, which was designed in 1963 and constructed between 1966 and 1967. Daly's neoclassical or neoformalist design contrasted with the traditional period revival styles of Nebraska's other cathedrals. This is Grand Island's cathedral, and was a result of the diocese's adoption of modern design. Many of the new churches, schools, hospitals, and religious houses constructed under Bishops Kucera and Casey were completed in variations of the international style, which eschewed the elaborate ornament of revival styles for straight lines, simplified geometric forms, and modern materials. Of the 132 parishes and missions in the diocese, 24 had new churches constructed between 1950 and 1963. Of these, 13 were modernist designs. 6 were combinations of modernism and traditional revival styles, usually the Gothic revival, and 5 were purely traditional Gothic or Romanesque revival style buildings. Churches such as St. Vincent's in Osceola and St. John's in Lincoln simplified traditional church plans without eliminating the basic layout of a church with clearly defined nave and sanctuary. In regards to Daly's design, diocesan spokesman openly stated that, quote, "The great cathedrals were departures from tradition at one time and spoke to the people of their day of the eternal newness of Christianity. Ours is a new and vital generation, and we have been given new materials, new skills in construction and engineering. The new cathedral, therefore, needs to be a contemporary design," end quote. The diocesan newspaper also ran columns on the history and design of cathedrals to educate parishioners and to highlight modernist cathedrals, such as the Sacred Heart Cathedral in Salina, Kansas, which was constructed between 1951 and 1953. Constructed of reinforced concrete, the cathedral's design reflects the enormous grain elevators that punctuate the landscape of the Great Plains. As you can see, it mimics the layout of the silos, and it has the silo-like forms repeated across its facade. Otherwise, it's very modern in its very basic geometric layout and organization. In addition to showcasing new cathedrals of neighboring dioceses, the parish newspaper also featured new churches, schools, and rectories, which were constructed within the diocese itself, often with full pages dedicated to listing the firms involved in their design and construction. Following the success of the development campaign, progress on the cathedral and related buildings continued at a rapid and steady pace. Construction on the new Chancery building at 33rd Street and Sheridan Boulevard, which is in this slide, began in 1960 and was completed by mid-1961, although the dedication was not held until October of that year. In 1962, Bishop Casey announced that the cathedral would be dedicated to the risen Christ, and that, quote, architects, artists, and theologians are engaged in studies and research to find inspiration from this central truth in Christianity for the planning of the cathedral. By 1963, all of the major buildings associated with the diocesan development campaign had been completed, except for the cathedral. So this is a rendering of the finalized design that was completed in 1963. The previous design from 1960 served primarily as a marketing tool and clearly underwent numerous revisions prior to the release of the final design in 1963, which itself was built between 1963 and 1965. The clearly new formalist design was more openly modern and dispensed with the traditionalist aspects of the original design. The plan follows a basic rectangular format. It retains the separated space of the narthex and the nave. The narthex features large floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows, which in the original design would have been in the nave. These stained glass windows shine into the narthex, which is then separated from the nave by a screen consisting of cut glass. The nave itself is this open rectangular space, which is made possible by the use of all-steel construction. The overall plan is of the Latin cross design, so there is still a transept. The transepts, however, have been lowered in height. They are not full height with the nave. There is no dome, over the crossing. Instead, the dome has been replaced by a large metal spire that would support bells. The walls themselves would be of cast granite, featuring an intricate textured design and irregularly shaped openings for stained glass windows. These walls would consist actually of two cast panels, one facing the exterior and one facing the interior, as you can see here in these construction photographs. The interior panels integrate into their design abstracted stations of the cross, which you'll be able to see further on. The furnishings, including the altar, the pews, the cathedral, lecterns, communion tables, wall sconces, were all designed by the Leo Aedeli firm, which feature combinations of white marble and black granite in basic geometric forms. All of these combine to form a very futuristic interior, which is punctuated by unique examples of art. Here again, further construction photos. You can clearly see how this church was put together. The steel columns are clad in marble, and it's interesting because the marble cladding itself reflects the I-beams that form the essential structure of this church. They're not designed in such a way as to hide the nature of the structure. And you can also clearly see how these large cast panels were put into place. This is one of the stations of the cross. These are all cast into the panels themselves, and they are essentially abstract representations of the Stations of the Cross. The stained glass windows in the narthex represent the resurrection and work in an amazing fashion with how the sun tracks across the southern sky throughout the day as this bright yellow and white light comes through and moves across the church. The cut glass depicts scenes from the resurrection, from the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, and representations of the Eucharist. And when the time of day is right, the resurrection scene on that cut glass aligns just right with the stained light, the glass coming through of that narthex, and it just creates a very emotional and moving scene, especially when seen from inside the nave, looking out towards the narthex. Like I said, the interior incorporates works of art by many noted artists. The stained glass, which we see here, was by the Rumbosch Studio of New York. The cut glass was by Robert Harmon of the noted Emil Frey Studio of St. Louis. In the side chapel, on the east side, we have a mosaic by the Hungarian mosaicist and sculptor Giovanni Hajnal, which is quite unique in that it depicts the Holy Family on one part of the mosaic on the left, and then on the right-hand side, a representative Nebraska family, along with a depiction of our noted Capitol building. And here you can see it in place. Hajnal also sculpted the cover for the baptistry, which is located in the narthex. In the other side chapel on the west side, where the tabernacle is located, we have a sculpture by the Italian Angelo Biancini, which he did a scene of Jesus and his disciples at Emmaus, which is quite appropriate, as this is one of the key representations of the Eucharist in the Holy Bible. And here we can see the current chapel. Included in the design, as it originally was put together, we had a large bronze sculpture by the Italian Giorgio Vivarelli of a tall, gaunt, risen Christ, designed to show the Christ the moment he rises out of the tomb, before he has been completely transformed. This statue, which is currently located outside the cathedral, was originally cantilevered off of the wooden screen behind the altar. And it was located there until 1994, when it was replaced with the current statue of the risen Christ. Behind the wooden screen is where the organ is located and the choir, which is very interesting acoustically, because it essentially turns that entire end of the church into like almost a giant speaker. For when the choir sings, the music just seems to come out of the front of the church towards the parishioners. I did manage to find an example of how the statue would have originally looked like as it was originally mounted. This is actually the Church of Cristo Redentore in Tuscany, in Italy, where they also have a copy of Vivarelli's statue of the risen Christ. In their case, it's gilded, and it's cantilevered off of their apse. So this is an approximation of how it would have appeared in our cathedral. The stained glass windows are all designed by the French artist Max Ingrand of the Studio Fontana Arte out of Milan. So we actually have a very significant collection of European artists here in Lincoln in the Cathedral of the Risen Christ. And it's very interesting how this collection came together, the story of the cathedral, and how it ties into the larger story of the development of church architecture in this time period. Now, the form of Lincoln's Cathedral is part of this period of transformation in the Catholic Church that is very much associated with the 1960s, but started decades before. So, this relationship between church and modern architecture really starts under Pope Pius XII, who was Pope from 1939 until 1958. Under Pope Pius, he issued several encyclicals which addressed changes in the liturgy and in religious art, the most important of which was Medietur Dei in 1947. In this encyclical, Pope Pius XII stressed the importance of tradition and the primacy of the Eucharist during and outside the Mass, while at the same time opening the doors to greater participation by the congregation in the Mass through singing and music, which was not limited to Gregorian chant but open to modern songs and compositions. He extended this openness to art and architecture as well, stating, quote, "Recent works of art which lend themselves to the materials of modern composition should not be universally despised and rejected through prejudice. Modern art should be given free scope in the due and reverent service of the Church and sacred rites, provided that they preserve a correct balance between styles, tending neither to extreme realism nor to excessive symbolism," end quote. Pope Pius XII's position on the relationship between church and modern art and architecture was popularized in the United States by an emerging group of professionals, the liturgical consultant. Now targets of criticism by those seeking to return to a more traditional form of architecture and worship, consultants such as Father H.A. Reinhold implemented a position outlined in Medietur Dei by attempting to combine the precepts of modernism advocated by the major architecture schools of the 1950s with a changing focus of the liturgy that stressed the sacrament of communion and increasing participation by the lay congregation. Reinhold, who drew this diagram and included it as part of his book, Speaking of Liturgical Architecture, called for a functional approach to church design, where the design of the building directly derived from the liturgical activities within. He published his book in 1952. The book illustrated what he considered his core ideas and provided diagrams of his organizational principles as well as a diagram of his ideal church. These diagrams demonstrate key similarities to the design of the Cathedral of the Risen Christ, which shows a tempering of the new approach with traditional principles. Comparing the two, the cathedral's floor plan closely follows Father Reinhold's plan for a church, with the congregation located between the baptismal font at the entrance to the church and the altar on access to the other side of the nave. The modernist spire on the exterior of the Cathedral of the Risen Christ is centered over the altar, providing an architectural expression for the most important liturgical space. The bishop's chair presides over the entire space. However, the cathedral does not adopt Father Reinhold's more radical ideas, such as diamond or round-shaped plans, and retains the traditional Latin cross organization with a clearly defined nave, transept, and sanctuary. Liturgical reforms continued under Pius XII and his successors, Pope St. John XIII and Pope Paul VI. These changes culminate in the Second Vatican Council's document Sacrosanctum Concilium, which was issued in 1963. The same year the cathedral design was finalized and construction commenced. Despite the current widespread criticism of the Council's reforms and their impact upon church design, the initial impact of the Council's work upon church construction in the early 1960s was limited. Only one chapter in Sacrosanctum Concilium addressed liturgical art, stating that the church has not adopted any particular style as her very own. The art of our own days, coming from every race and region, shall also be given free scope in the church, stated the council. The council's guidance on architecture was particularly vague, stating that, quote, "When churches are to be built, let great care be taken that they be suitable for the celebration of liturgical services and for the active participation of the faithful," end quote. The council did call for every diocese to establish commissions on liturgy, music, and art to guide the application of these directives. The council, therefore, did not mandate radical new forms for churches. Instead, it empowered parishes and dioceses to design buildings that reflected their needs and their communities. In Lincoln's case, the overall form and design of the cathedral lay, as always, in the hands of the diocese and its bishop. The Second Vatican Council may have had a much larger impact upon the cathedral's decorative scheme than upon its overall form. The selection of Vivarelli, Hajnal, Biancini, and Ingren probably resulted not only from the influence of Leo A. Daly, which has a stained glass window by Max Ingren in their Omaha headquarters dating to 1960, but also from Bishop Casey's frequent trips to Rome starting in 1960, when he presented the initial plans for the cathedral to Pope John XIII, then in association, not Pope John XIII, that should be the 23rd. I'm sorry, I just realized that. Forgive me. Continuing on. And then in association with the Second Vatican Council, starting in 1962 with the opening session, Bishop Casey attended all of the sessions of the Second Vatican Council. While he was in Rome, he may have probably facilitated communication between the Daly firm and the International Institute of Liturgical Art, which is listed as the primary organization responsible for the art in the cathedral. In addition, Bishop Casey may have been able to see the artists or their works, as all four collaborated with the Institute, had works in Rome, or were based in the city. The selection of these artists to work on the cathedral would have been reinforced by the Council's proclamations on art as well. As soon as the cathedral was completed, it was perceived as a monument to the spirit of the Vatican Council. The construction of the cathedral coincided with the council, with the groundbreaking in June 1963 and its dedication in August of 1965. At the dedication ceremony, Archbishop of Omaha Bergen stated in his homily that the cathedral, quote, "will be the continuing embodiment of the council," end quote, as it stood for a new beginning in the church and a period of openness, while at the same time reaffirming fundamental Catholic beliefs. The cathedral's modern design and expressionist outwork, though part of a decade-long adoption of modern architectural styles in the diocese, was taken to further symbolize a new start promised by Vatican II. A large stained glass window by Ernesto Tras depicting Pope John XXIII and Pope Paul VI standing before a collection of bishops was installed in the corridor leading to the bishop's chapel, also commemorated the council. The cathedral immediately became a landmark in Lincoln, drawing large crowds. Earlier that year, over 8,000 people toured the cathedral during an open house in 1965. Many appeared to share Archbishop Bergen's description of the cathedral as, quote, "a work of art, a gem of ecclesiastical perfection," end quote, and hoped that the cathedral would, as Bishop Casey stated at the consecration in May of 1965, quote, "stand for 100 years and more to teach all the lessons of eternal life." Like many buildings associated with the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, the cathedral has been reinterpreted by later generations. The optimism of the council has been replaced by a return to tradition and the desire to revive the methods and places of worship as they existed prior to the council. This appears to be primarily a result of the fervent experimentation that occurred in the 2 decades following Vatican II, which led to the construction of churches that modern critics, such as Stephen Schroeder, characterize as confused due to the misinterpretation of Vatican II. In the late 2000s, the return to traditional forms of both the Mass and architecture gained impetus under Pope Benedict XVI. Bishops adopted more conservative approaches to church decoration and design. Publications such as the Sacred Architecture Journal and internet blogs such as the New Liturgical Movement reinforce this call to tradition. This reaction against late modern and postmodern churches has colored the appreciation and understanding of mid-century churches as well. While this reaction has not led to a dramatic reconfiguration of modernist churches, their decorative schemes are often subject to modification by the reintroduction of traditionalist art pieces that clash with the building's original design. For example, Vivarelli's statue of the risen Christ was removed from the sanctuary and replaced with a new wood statue. At the same time, traditional stations of the cross were installed, replacing in use the abstract stations that were cast into the walls of the cathedral. A more extreme example within the diocese would be the demolition in 2012 of the 1960 Newman Center near the University of Nebraska and its replacement with a period Gothic revival church designed by McCreary architects. The Cathedral of the Risen Christ is a monument to mid-century modern architecture and to the impact of the Second Vatican Council. As a result, it also embodies the challenges faced by scholars and admirers of mid-century ecclesiastical architecture as parishioners, clergy, and architects look to return to more traditional forms. The reaction against churches built in postmodern or deconstructionist styles has negatively impacted the appreciation and evaluation of mid-century examples, especially those that were innovative in their form and decoration. Only by investigating and understanding these buildings, how they absorbed and reflected the unique social and theological environment of their day, can we then change the negative perception surrounding them and restore their original appreciation for their own unique approaches to Catholic architecture. Thank you. So I'll be happy to take questions, to discuss the cathedral. I would like to point out, going back a few slides, some of my favorite stylistic aspects of the church building itself. It's absolutely fascinating how the interior of this church is put together and how it blends the modern and the traditional. This church in layout and plan is very much a traditional space that matches cathedrals found across the world of how you progress through the interior, especially this entry space, the narthex with its entryways. You enter this colorful space that's always bathed in this special light. Even on a cloudy day, you still get a very just transformative feeling in this space. And then walking through, entering the nave, and turning around to look through the cut glass and to see the stained glass behind. It's just almost magical how that works together to create just an entirely new experience. And I would imagine, especially so for the priests who celebrate in this cathedral, who get to see this every Sunday or every weekday. It's absolutely amazing. And then the quality of the art that's located within this church. These artists who created the artwork for the cathedral are world-renowned. They have examples across the country. Hajnal, some of his most significant work is actually here in the United States at the Cathedral of St. Joseph in Hartford, Connecticut, where he did cut glass for the cathedral and several other types of artwork for them. He was widely known in Italy for his mosaic works as well, and widely recognized for it. And then Vivarelli, who did the statue of the risen Christ, is also well known. He has artwork across the United States. Some of his most significant work is actually in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as well. And then the contrast between materials. It has something to say about the work by the Leo Daly firm. The use of stone, of cast modern materials, those cast panels that we saw previously here. These are made out of crushed granite that were then put into like a cement binder and cast into these huge panels on the north side of Lincoln, and then they were loaded onto flatbed trucks and transported south to Sheridan Boulevard, where they would then taken up by cranes and moved into position. Again, there's two of these panels, one for the interior and one for the exterior, and how they managed to line up and provide spaces for these irregular openings for the stained glass windows. And those openings, combined with the massiveness of those walls, really does reflect the influence of Le Corbusier and his church at Ronchamp, where he has massive concrete walls which are punctuated by irregular stained glass openings. Now, those windows in France were of just geometric designs. They weren't the more traditional examples that we have here in Lincoln. Yes?
It was anticipated it would cost $1.8 million?
So the question was, the initial cost was anticipated to be $1.8 million. According to what I read in the Diocesan newspaper, that was the initial budget. Approximately about $1 million would be dedicated to the cathedral. The other $800,000 would be for the chancery and the other buildings as part of the initial development campaign. But it was such a runaway success. They raised $4 million by the end of the period, that they used that money to fund not only the cathedral, but numerous other projects. The cathedral itself, though, they kept it around that budgeted amount of approximately $1 million.
Did that include the artwork?
So the question was, did that include the artwork? The answer is, I do not know. I reached out to the archives with the diocese, but I was not able to get access to any of the documents from the time period. And since the architecture firm Leo Daly doesn't have any records dating to this time period, there was a purge of their old records about 15 years ago now. I have no way of knowing that unless I, find some way to access the archives. Yes?
Do you know if there are any relics of saints on the altar or about?
So the question is do I know if there are any relics in the altar? The answer is I do not know. I would assume that there is some sort of maybe second or third class relic. Maybe I know that the regulations within the Catholic Church require cathedrals to have some sort of relic associated with the altar. But in terms of providing a firm answer to that question, I really do not know. Yes, a question in the back.
So historically, patrons of a church would be recognized through art.
Mm-hmm.
In the mosaics, are the people depicted in Nebraska, for example, is that a specific family?
All right, so the question was, historically, artwork is associated with patronage. A rich merchant or other parishioner would provide funds to the church, and the artwork would be installed, and it would be associated with that person. And more often than not, that person would be depicted in the artwork. And so the question was, were there any Nebraska models for the mosaics in terms of an identifiable person that sponsored the artwork? Based upon my research, as far as I know, no. It's just a representation of what Hajnal believed was a hardworking Nebraska family. It's supposed to be just that symbolism connecting the current people of the parish to the example of the Holy Family. So, yes.
This is my comment. The stained glass windows are currently in the process of being taken out, restored, cleaned, and then put back in with a clear plex on the outside. So for years they've always been cloudy because we had a cloudy plex on the outside. And today they're brilliant. It was wonderful.
Yes, yes. So the comment was that the stained glass windows are currently being restored and they're being protected by the installation of a new clear outer material. And you can clearly see the impact of that. Like I said, I visited the cathedral just this past Sunday. It was a very cloudy day, but you couldn't tell inside the church. It's still shone as it would on a bright, sunny day. And it just makes me wonder, well, how would it be if we went out to it today where there's a bit more sun, or to go, attend a service when the sun is just in the right spot to shine in through all that beautiful glass that they have there. You can tell that the church does have some preservation issues that they are currently working through. Like all modern buildings across the United States, people were pushing the boundaries in the 1960s, using flat roofs and modern technology and modern materials, and that presents challenges to us today as how do we maintain these properties? How do we take care of these materials? How do we repair them if they can be repaired, or replace them if they need to be replaced? And how do we do that in such a way that it's faithful to the original design and the intent of the building? So I just hope that the diocese works hard to really preserve this gem that they have. I, as National Register Coordinator with the State Historical Society, would love to work with the diocese to actually get this building listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It would clearly qualify for the National Register and be a tremendous asset to both the state and the country to have it recognized. All right. So thank you all for attending, and greatly appreciate it.